All right, hello everyone. This lecture is going to go over chapter 4 from your text, which covers ethical guidelines for psychological or psychology research. As always, I highly recommend that you actually read the textbook. Your book does an excellent job of explaining all this stuff. So not only listen to the lecture, but read and take notes as well. So the text starts off with explaining some famous studies that were done in history that were unethical, what people at the time didn't really care, which kind of led to changes in research and how research was done. So the first one is going to look at the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. So there is a YouTube video that I'm not going to watch. Ugh, I'm not going to watch right now. Let me pull this up. We're not going to watch the YouTube video in the lecture, but the link is on Educat, so definitely watch that before finishing the rest of the lecture. Okay, but the YouTube video explains what happened in the Tuskegee experiment. Basically what happened back in 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service, around the time of the Great Depression, this health service wanted to study the effects of syphilis, and at the time, about 35% of poor Black men had syphilis. So the U.S. federal agency, U.S. Public Health Service, decided to start a study with 600 men in Tuskegee, which is was a very low-income farmer town in the South. About 400 of the men had syphilis and 200 did not. And they basically just wanted to see what syphilis did to the body, how long the disease, would last before it killed someone, and just kind of explain like the course of the disease. So the study basically just looked at the effects of untreated syphilis. So at the time, especially in this rural area, people didn't really know what syphilis was. They just thought of it as being bad blood, when actually it was a disease that was sexually transmitted. But a lot of these people in this little farmer town, Black males, were illiterate, couldn't read, didn't really understand medicine and stuff like that. So these experimenters came in from the US. They were telling the participants, okay, if you participate in the study, you will get free medical care, right? And at the time, these poor Black men did not have any access to medicine. So they were giving insurance, medical care for free. The men were told that they were being treated for any diseases that they were found to have. They would do blood tests, etc. So the men thought they were getting treated when actually they weren't getting any treatment at all. The researchers were just observing the men, taking blood samples, and even at sometimes doing spinal taps, which are incredibly painful procedures, just to see, different white blood cell counts and stuff like that when not actually given patients treatment at all. So these men thought they were getting treated, thought they were getting medicine, health care, when in fact they weren't. And when the experiment started, there wasn't a good cure for syphilis. There were cures out there, but they were very problematic, a lot of things with heavy metals, so not really a good treatment. But in 1943, which is about 10 years after this experiment started, penicillin came out as a treatment, which treated syphilis, a bunch of other infections and diseases, treated it well, barely any side effects. And at this time, the research was still going on 10 years later. Even when penicillin came out, they didn't give the participants penicillin. They just let the disease progress, told the men they were getting treated, when again, they weren't. The study was only supposed to last a year. It lasted way more than that. The study ended in 1972. So 40 years the study went on. These poor men were not given any treatment, even when they thought they were. So obviously this is not an ethical experiment. And now we know this. At the time, people thought, they wanted to know what happened with this disease and thought that the benefits of the experiment outweighed the risks, when obviously, in fact, they don't. Okay, and this is one of the big studies that led to kind of a change in how research is done. So obviously there's some unethical choices going on. Participants weren't treated respectfully, so they're not told even if they had syphilis or not. They didn't know, if they had a disease, if they were healthy, whatever. They weren't informed about any cures that became available, like the penicillin. They most likely were coerced into participating in the study because they were told they were getting free healthcare. When these men died, which a lot of them did, the government paid for their burial fees just so that they could do an autopsy on the dead body, but the families, liked that they were getting the burial fees paid for. And obviously there was no real informed consent because the patients really had no idea what the study even was doing. Okay, so obviously no respect for the participants. Participants were harmed, mostly because they weren't told about the treatment that was actually effective that would have cured those who had the disease. Since these men couldn't read, they most likely never even knew that there was a treatment. And not only that, they were given procedures such as spinal taps, I can't talk today, spinal taps, etc., that were unnecessary for the men to go through, and they're very painful. Okay, and then the last thing which makes this unethical, obviously there's a lot going on here, but the participants were a targeted, disadvantaged social group. Okay, so the men in the study were all African American and Black, poor, and the study was meant to benefit all races, all socioeconomic backgrounds, right? Because syphilis at the time infected a lot of people throughout not only the US, but other countries as well. But the research targeted this poor group and took advantage of them, which obviously is unethical. So that's one of the first studies that was done that was unethical, that really led to a shift. Another one was the Milgram obedience study, which I'm sure you've heard of as well, which also there's a YouTube video on EduCat explaining it. So this study tested authority, was done in the 1960s, and basically was just looking at how ethical decision making involves like a balance. Your text does a really good job of explaining the study, so if you're not familiar with it, read through it in your text. But basically, there was a teacher who was a participant, was blind to the study. They were told they had to teach the other patient, and if they got a question wrong, they shocked them. And the shocks got increasingly stronger, so they would give a low-level shock if they got it wrong once, and as they kept getting questions wrong, the shock would get higher and higher. No one was actually getting shocked, but the teacher did not know this. And the teacher would keep giving shocks, and they would get feedback from the person who they thought they were shocking, saying, "Ow, it hurts, don't do, please stop, blah, blah, blah." But they were saying, "Oh, you have to, shock the participant, like give them the shock." And most of the teachers went through with the shocks until it was like a lethal shock, and the person who they thought they were shocking wasn't responsive anymore. So obviously, at the time, it was a good social experiment. They thought it was interesting to see, how obedient people were, but obviously not very ethical. But this obviously isn't going to be as cut and dry as the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, right? So is it ethical to put the teacher participants through a stressful experience, right? If they think they have to shock someone, is there any lasting effects after the participants had been debriefed? So at the end of the study, the teachers were debriefed and said, "Oh, you actually didn't harm anyone." But I mean, if you just went through with a lethal level of shock, that might affect how you perceive yourself, right? So obviously could have lasting damage. So this one, you really have to balance the risk to participants with the benefit to society. So they learned some very interesting things, but the people who participated in this study later on really had some issues. they thought that they were capable of giving lethal shocks to someone that they didn't know because they were just following rules. Okay, so studies like this that were done in the early 1900s or even later 1900s, 1960, 1970, really changed the way we started to think about research. And it led to some ethical principles being written. So the first time we see like a list of ethical principles was through the Belmont Report, and this was created in 1976, so end of the 70s. And it came up with some principles, core ethical principles for all research. So not just psychology, but medical research, any type of research being done now was supposed to follow these principles. Okay, so we have the principles of respect for person, principle of beneficience, and principle of justice. Okay, so first one, the principle of respect for persons, kind of is a two-parter. So first, the participants should be free to decide for themselves whether or not they would like to participate in a study. Okay, so this includes something that we call informed consent, which hopefully you're all familiar with. But basically, when participating in the study, the participants need to be told about what the study is going to involve and get explained to, step by step what all is involved in the study, and then decide for themselves if they want to participate or not. Okay. So informed consent in the Tuskegee Experiment obviously was not given because the men couldn't read, had no idea what was going on. And then in the Milgram obedience study, they kind of were told, but they were lied to in such a way that they didn't know that there was, risks to that research. And allowing people to participate, if they want to, and don't participate if they don't want to, also includes not coercing participants into the research, which also happened in the Tuskegee Experiment, right? So you can't give participants a large incentive to participate. So whether that's a large sum of money or, if you're in an academic setting, telling them, you do this one thing, you'll get an A in the class, or we'll graduate you with honors, large incentives can't be used to get people to participate. Obviously, in some situations, you can give some sort of incentive, but when that incentive becomes too great, that it's kind of taken away people's free will, then it becomes an issue. The second part of respect for persons says that less autonomous individuals are entitled to special protection. So individuals who can't necessarily make decisions for themselves, can't give informed consent, have special protection. So this includes children, individuals with cognitive disabilities, as well as prisoners. So children and people with cognitive disabilities, a lot of times their parent or guardian is allowed to give informed consent for them, which might even be iffy, but children can't say for themselves, right, because they can't make the decision if they want to participate in a study because they don't really understand what's going on. Their parents have to give permission for them. And then prisoners also are entitled to special protection just because it's very easy for a prisoner to be coerced because there's a lot at risk. Prisoners are more likely to participate in something if they think it's gonna, take time off their sentence, if it's going to make them look better, if they're coming up for parole, if they think that participating is gonna get them better food or, better treatment from guards or whatever it may be. It's very easy for prisoners to be coerced because, again, there's a lot at stake. So prisoners also get special treatment. And any studies trying to do research on prisoners is very heavily looked into before it's approved. And we'll talk about the process for approval of the studies in a minute. Okay, so that's the first principle of the Belmont Report. Next, we have the principle of beneficience, which beneficience just refers to the act of doing good. So we want to make sure that the research that we're doing is not causing unnecessary harm. Okay, so researchers are required to take measures to protect participants from harm and ensure their well-being. Okay, so that's weighing the risks and benefits of the research. Also looking at who might benefit and who might be harmed in the research. And obviously physical harm and physical benefits are easier to assess than psychological harm and psychological benefits, right? We can measure if someone's getting sick, if people die, obviously that's intense physical harm, right? But things that kind of mess with people's heads a little bit more difficult to distinguish. So obviously Tuskegee study caused great physical harm to the participants. They had a disease that could be treated for 30 years of their experiment, but were denied treatment. So that's causing great physical harm, not only to the participants, but to their wives, their sexual partners. A lot of the participants had children that are born with congenital syphilis. So it caused physical harm, not only to the participants, do not restart, but to their families and stuff as well. The Milgram caused psychological harm. So the people who were shocking people to lethal doses obviously had some lasting effects from that experiment, but it's not as easy to measure. Okay, and then the last principle is the principle of justice, which is looking at the balance of who's participating, who is at risk, and who is benefiting from the research. Okay, so if you're applying this to the Tuskegee syphilis study, who's at risk? They singled out poor Black men in Tuskegee, right? But the benefit of the research really benefited everyone. Like I said earlier, a lot of people at the time had syphilis, and they were doing this study to understand how the disease progressed so that they could better treat it for other people, just not the people who were in the study. So when coming up with the study, looking at who we want to include for our participants, we need to make sure that those participating is representative of who's going to benefit. Okay, so that's the principle of justice. So that is the Belmont Report, which was the first, again, kind of ethical guidelines that we had. In 2002, the APA, American Psychological Association, also released some ethical guidelines that governed psychologists specifically, scientists, educators, or practitioners in, the ethical realm. Okay, so this is a little bit more geared towards psychologists or the study of psychology in general, and is a lot more detailed than just those 3 principles of the Belmont Report. So the general principles of the APA, there's 5 of them. So this chart does a good job of showing them. So we have the Belmont Report over here, beneficience, justice, and respect for persons. APA has 3 principles that match up exactly. So beneficience here, justice, respect for persons, respect for people's rights and dignity. So all those are the same, the definitions and stuff we just talked about. But the APA also has 2 extras, one of them being fidelity and responsibility. So that is establishing relationships of trust, accepting responsibility for professional behavior. So this is, again, in research, teaching, clinical practice, all the above. And then the other principle that the APA includes is integrity, which is to strive to be accurate, truthful, and honest, again, as a teacher, researcher, or practitioner. Okay, so most of these match up perfectly, but you just have these 2 extras that the APA include that mean that. Okay, so the APA just wanted to have a little bit more of a specific towards psychology, ethical guidelines. Besides the general principles, they have 10 ethical standards. The APA is them. And these standards really guide, specifically are geared towards research, teaching, or, practicing psychology. And one ethical standard in particular, ethical standard 8, is important for research. So it's kind of the most important for this class since it's research methods in psych. So I want to go through all the parts of the standard. And you can see these standards are way more specific than just the basic principles. right? So standard 8, we have standard like 8.1, 8.2, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These are the important ones that we're going to talk about for this class at least. So ethical standard 8, again, is all-encompassing for ethical standards for research. It includes information. There's going to be slides on these in a second. For the institutional review boards, informed consent, deception, debriefing, research misconduct, which includes data fabrication and plagiarism, and data falsification. And then lastly, animal research. Okay, so we're going to go a little more in depth for all of these. So the first one is the institutional review boards, which is standard 8.1. Institutional review board, also known as IRB. So anytime there is psychology research being done that includes human participants, there has to be an IRB that approves the research proposal. Okay, so before you start research, hopefully you know this by now, you have to create a research proposal, propose what you're going to do, and kind of explain step by step, what the research is, why it's important, who's benefiting, yada, yada, yada. And if it includes humans, before you can start that research, you have to go through an IRB to get approval, okay? So typically the IRB has around 5 people. Always, though, it has at least one scientist, one academic interest outside of science, so like a professor in, English or science is chemistry, other disciplines other than science, a community member with no ties to the institution, and if there's prisoners involved in the study, then at least one prisoner advocate as well. Okay, so at least one of all of these. And basically, you give a detailed application describing your study. You need to include risks and benefits, participants, what's happening with them, and the end, how it's going to benefit society, right? Explain step by step your research, why it's important. Explain how you're going to give informed consent, how you're going to respect your participants' privacy. And the IRB goes through and judges your research and saying if it's, good or not, if you need to make tweaks, change things, or if it's good to go, then they give you the approval and you can begin your research. So the idea of this is just to give a multi-perspective judgment, so that we're not only hearing from, psychologists that do the same type of research as you're doing, because obviously different people are going to have different opinions about what's ethical and what's not. Okay, so a community member that's never done science before, if they're reading your proposal, they might catch stuff that maybe someone who's been in science for a long time wouldn't necessarily think about. Okay, so IRBs are very important when we're using human participants. The next standard, 8.2, is informed consent, which you already know what this is. This just gives a little more detailed explanation. So researcher has to explain the study to all potential participants in everyday basic language so that they can understand and let them decide if they want to participate. Again, there's no coercion. You can't give people these crazy incentives to kind of force them to participate. And if you're dealing with less autonomous individuals, then you have special protection there. Sometimes it's not necessary to get informed consent. So if it's not likely to cause harm and in an educational setting, a lot of times it's not really necessary. But again, you'll go through that IRB approval to make sure that you don't need to. If you're doing an anonymous questionnaire, so people are answering questions that, aren't going to be traced back to them in any way, then you don't need informed consent because, the privacy of the person is going to be protected. And then if observations are naturalistic, meaning you're just watching people, walk down the hallway and see how they react when, someone's walking on the wrong side of the hallway or something, some sort of social experiment where you're just watching people, then you don't need informed consent either. Okay, so giving informed consent, not only are you informing people about, what the study is, but about what's going to happen with the results and data. So for most cases, you want to keep the results private and confidential. So specific individuals, what they answered or, what they did can't really be traced to them specifically through your research. You can look at obviously like overarching themes with all of your participants, but you need to keep the results from each individual private and confidential. So informed consent includes not only, what's going to happen in the research, but what's going to happen once the research is finished. Okay. The next standard is 8.7, which is deception. So sometimes lying about research to the participants is important. So there's two different types of deception. Deception by omission, which is when researchers withhold details of the study from participants, or deception by commission, which is when researchers lie to participants. Okay, so if you're doing some sort of social psychology experiment, let's say, for example, you want to see how people react to a theft. You tell them they're going to be participating in an experiment, but don't tell them that this guy's going to steal a purse from across the room, right? You're omitting the fact that there's, a theft going to happen. But obviously, if you're doing an experiment like this, deception is necessary because you can see what people are going to do naturally in the situation. Because if you tell them, okay, you're going to sit here and the theft's going to happen, we're going to see how you react, obviously that's not going to be a natural reaction, right? So in some cases, deception may be beneficial and may be, approved. But also you have to be careful because too much deception can lead people, participants, the general public, not to trust researchers. Which is not a good thing. You don't want to like blatantly continue to lie about all these different things because then people feel like they're getting tricked and not always a good thing. Okay. The next standard is debriefing, standard 8.8. So debriefing happens at the end of the experiment. It's a structured conversation. It's describing basically what happened in this experiment. So if there was deception, you have to describe the nature of it and why it was necessary. So explain, well, if we did tell you that someone was going to steal something, obviously we couldn't see your actual reaction. Right? So to explain why you deceived the participant, you in the debriefing emphasize the importance of the research and attempt to create an honest relationship with the participant. So the whole point of debriefing is really to make the participant understand what just happened, why it's important, and trying to build a relationship and gain some trust, which is extra important if there was deception in the relationship, in the experiment. Okay. Typically, also during a debriefing, there's a written description of the study's goals, hypothesis, and references for additional research that's given to each participant. So if they're interested in it, they can do some further research and have kind of idea of what's going on in a written thing that they can take with them. Okay. The next standard, 8.10, data fabrication and data falsification, which obviously both of these, before even saying what they are not going to be good ideas. So data fabrication, so instead of recording what actually happened in the study or doing a study at all, researchers are going to invent data to fit their hypothesis. So you're fabricating false data or fake data just to prove your hypothesis. Data falsification is when researchers influence the study's results. So they either delete observations from a data set, they can influence subjects to respond in a particular way, they can influence their researchers, to measure things in such a way that helps prove what they want to prove, right? So it's taking actual observations, but changing, deleting ones that they don't want or influencing the way people are going to record or respond. Okay, so both of them obviously not good. It's mostly bad. Well, it's all bad, but you're misleading other scientists, right? So if you're publishing a study with fake data, If other scientists read that and then base their study off of what the data that you got, it can obviously cause problems, waste a lot of time, waste a lot of future time, future money on experiments that were based on lies, and also can mislead the general population. So if there is a study done, for example, about vaccines and how they cause autism, but the study was falsified, so they selectively reported data. They didn't report their financial interests. There's a lot of fraud. So this is the original paper that led to the idea that vaccines cause autism. The data in this paper was falsified. And even though now this article is retracted and scientists everywhere know that this information was not true, the researchers were getting paid by people who had different agendas. So they wanted to get specific data. They skewed their study to get that data so they would get paid. So even though this is retracted now, it's still obviously causing a lasting effect. People are scared of vaccines because this paper lied, and now people just take this as the truth. They hear it once, they don't, do any follow-up research, whatever, which can lead to obviously some big issues. Okay, so it's really important that data is real and is accurate. Okay, two more standards here. Plagiarism, standard 8.11. Plagiarism is representing the ideas or words of others as your own, which obviously is not good. So it's important in psychological research that we give credit to the original author. And there's APA guidelines for doing this. So we know it's kind of a pain to have everything cited correctly in your research papers or your proposals, whatever it may be. But it's important that we do this and do it consistently in a way that is the same for all of the APA, so that it's really easy to find the original authors and give credit where credit is due. Okay, so plagiarism, don't do it. And then the last standard we're going to talk about for research is standard 8.9, which includes information about animal research. So obviously we've already talked about human research. It's really important, not to harm human participants, both physically and psychologically. But a lot of research that we're doing includes animals, which can't give informed consent. A little bit more difficult to measure, the harm that's going on. So there's special protection for laboratory animals. So like the IRB for human research, we have the IACUC, Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, IACUC. And this board is going to be like the IRB, but for animals. Okay, so it's made of a number of different people. You can have scientist, veterinarian, community member, at least one of each. And they're just going to do the same thing that the IRB does, but look at animal research. Okay, so you give them the proposal of your research, they read through it, make sure that the benefits outweigh the risks, the animals, the least harm is done to the animals, no unnecessary harm is done to the animals. They go through and approve the research before it starts. And then the thing that's different about IACUC is that throughout the animal research, the animals, the IACUC monitors the care and treatment of the animals throughout. Okay, so the veterinarian is going to come in multiple times throughout the research, make sure that all your animals are healthy, well cared for, everything looks good, making sure that there's no mistreatment of these animals throughout the research, right? The IRB just approves it in the beginning, and that's it. Okay, so there's animal care guidelines, also known as the 3 R's, that is really important in animal research. Making sure, again, the animals don't have any unnecessary harm. The 3 R's are replacement. So if there's an alternative to use animals, then we should use it. So now there are a number of different computer simulations, different types of things that we can do. where we don't have to use live animals in the research. So if there's a better option out there than using live animals, we want to do that instead. Right? So that's replacement. Refinement. How could research procedures and aspects of animal care be altered to reduce animal distress? So making sure that our study is set up in such a way that the least harm and distress done to the animals is as small as possible, right? We don't want any unnecessary suffering. We want to refine the research so that's causing the least amount of harm. And then the last one, reduction, which we want to use the fewest number of animals possible, right? So if using animals is our only option, obviously we want to use the fewest number so we're not causing harm to an unnecessary amount of animals. Okay, so the animal guidelines, when looking over the proposal, looks at all of this stuff to make sure that there's no unnecessary harm, but also gives strict guidelines for housing. So depending on the type of animal, it tells you if they need to be grouped in, cage with one other animal, if they need to be alone, what type of cage, what type of bedding. A lot of the animals, you need to give them toys or some sort of, entertainment, whatever you want to call it, in the cage, right? So they're not just being all thrown into a cage and just left there. They have cage that suits their needs. It gives guidelines for temperature of the habitat they need to be in, humidity, lighting, noise conditions, how to clean and how often to clean. Okay, also like food, water, those things are included as well. But different animals have different sleep schedules, so the lighting in the room mimics their natural sleep schedules, noise conditions, etc., etc. So doing animal research is a lot more involved than human research because not only are you doing the research, but you're taking care of all of these animals. Okay. Good. All right, and then our last side, just looking at ethical decision making, and just it's a thoughtful balance. And so obviously when doing any sort of research, you really have to balance the priorities. So again, looking at the benefits and the risks of the research and making sure that there's not any unnecessary stress or harm or whatever to either humans or animals, right? So weighing the potential harm, again, just what knowledge is really going to be gained from the research. And this is looking at like past research too. If a study has been done 500 times and you want to do it again, maybe at this point we're not really gaining any knowledge from repeating the study. Obviously, we want to replicate it a few times, but after a certain point, there's not a need to do that study again. Okay, so ethical research is ongoing, it's dynamic, it's all about balancing our priorities and really reflecting on, the risks and the benefits of the research. Okay, that's it for today. If you have any questions, let me know. Bye.